Hi, welcome to the Finding Harmony podcast. I'm your host, Harmony, and I'm here with my co host, Russell Case, who insists on being introduced.
People aren't going to know who I am unless you do. So I think that's real. I think that's key to how this whole thing should work. We have a wonderful guest on today. Surprisingly, just told us that he knew one of our previous guests, Babita, from pop-up events in Lexington, Kentucky.
Yeah, and they have something in common too.
The veganism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the plant-based veganism.
Right.
Well, how are you this morning?
Are you
I'm doing great.
Him?
Thanks,
I thought I'd say hi first, but yeah. Stuart, do you go by Stu? Stewie? Mr. Waldner?
Stuart is fine.
Stuart's fine. Stuart Waldner, our guest today, is an environmental food activist and author of Escape the Meatrix. Today, Stuart is going to talk about his battle against climate change, the real reason veggies are more expensive than a burger, and the environmental impact and effects of the meat eating industry on the planet. I wonder, Mr. Waldner, if you could tell us, Stuart, if you could tell us, what do you mean by escaping the Meatrix? What is that? How'd you come up with that title?
Okay, well, I'm using the world in the Matrix movies as a metaphor for our world. So in the Matrix movies, artificial intelligence has taken over the planet and is using humans as an energy source. And I say our world is a lot like that because human beings have taken over this planet. I mean, there's 8 billion of us here now, and we're using farmed animals as our energy source. So I'm saying that, we're living in the Matrix.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, just in the same way that the machines were living off humans. Of the humans as a battery source for themselves.
Yes.
We're now doing the same thing. We've created a farming industry where animals are now subject to our use of them.
Yeah, we're just treating animals not as living creatures, but as food commodities, just to serve us as kind of like the overlords or the AI in the Matrix. And, I was born into the Meatrix, and I think most of us, in the United States and many other parts of the world were born into the Meatrix. And, we were taught to eat animal-based foods at a very early age by our parents, and their parents learned it from their parents. And so this is a tradition that gets passed on from one generation to the next. And it's not a conscious choice that any of us have really made. I don't know anybody who woke up one day and said, I want to eat an animal-based, food. It's just something that we were taught to do. And, so I think it seems to me that because it's something that we were indoctrinated into, which I say in my book, it seems like it's natural, necessary, and nutritious. When the science that I reveal in my book says, eating animal-based foods is none of those things.
Yeah. Well, you're with the right audience because we were vegetarian before being vegetarian was a thing, really.
Before it was cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you could only find like soy milk at the one health food store in the city
if you lived in a city with a health food store.
Yeah. Where you're making your own almond milk. In the 90s.
In
Calgary, not that long ago.
In Calgary, you'd be lucky to find a health food store. It's true. But I have made my own soy milk, and it does need sugar for those of you at home, which I discovered. I'm interested in there was a thing you mentioned in your bio that really kind of tipped me off, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Harmony. I think you probably had something, but you talked about how you grew up expecting people to get sick, and you saw everybody as they were aging getting sick, and it reminded me of a yoga teacher that we knew. What's his name?
David Williams.
David Williams would say, growing up in North Carolina, that he didn't see people growing up older and wiser. People just grew up older and sicker. And you were sort of looking at your own life and thinking, well, this is what I would expect for myself. I grew up and like my grandparents, I'm going to start smoking as soon as I can and eat meat. And my grandmother would have a beer for breakfast and start on her day. And I wonder if she got emphysema and all those other diseases. I wonder if you could talk about that experience yourself and growing up in Kentucky and what you thought and expected for yourself.
Yes, well, Kentucky is my home. I've lived here my whole life, and that's where my family and friends are. And it's a beautiful state. I live in the city of Lexington, which is kind of the central part of Kentucky, known as the Bluegrass region. And like I said, it's beautiful. The people are wonderful, but we have a lot of unhealthy people in the state as a whole. In fact, nationally, we rank 48th in healthy behaviors and 47th in health outcomes. So I guess we're doing a little bit better on the output than the input. But really, there's no other state. There's only one other state, actually, that has more people with multiple chronic health conditions than Kentucky. So, and that's West Virginia, our neighbor. So, yeah, I grew up seeing a lot of people in my community who were struggling with chronic conditions like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and various cancers due to lifestyle. And I really thought that it was inevitable, that we would all come down with some kind of illness, some kind of chronic condition, and that the best we could hope for was to try to manage it with, pills, shots, and surgeries. And so I was really concerned about that. I didn't want to become a statistic in my own state. And at the age of 23, I made a huge lifestyle shift. And that's when I gave up eating meat. And that was in 1985. And I did that because this medical science coming out at that time said, the saturated fats found in animal-based foods and in red meat in particular were a major contributor to heart disease, which is our number one killer, not only in Kentucky, but in the nation. So I figured, that's the science. I'm going to give up eating meat. And that's what I decided to do in 1985. And, since that whole time, I've enjoyed just incredible health. I think Benjamin Franklin said an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I think giving up meat was the ounce of prevention I needed so that I wouldn't need a cure. I've been able to avoid all these chronic conditions that so many people in my state suffer with. And, it's because of the food that we eat. It's not healthy for us, and it leads to chronic inflammation, which leads to a host of chronic illnesses. So I think the root of all of our chronic illnesses, it starts with our diet. And that's what I was able to change. And that's why I've enjoyed such good health. And I know if I can do it, other people can do it too. It's best to make the change before you're diagnosed with a chronic condition. But even if you have a chronic condition today, the science that I show in my book says, you can stabilize or reverse that chronic condition through a whole foods, plant-based lifestyle. So that's the information I want to share with people. It's so powerful.
Yeah, for sure.
I remember in 93, my first yoga teacher brought a video into class, and I was just stunned that, what he decided to show us, because I thought it was going to be another video of Richard Freeman or David Swenson. And what it was instead was an autopsy, and it was someone who had died of a heart attack. And I remember being 18, and he pulled out an 8-inch thick piece of string cheese out of the guy's aorta. And I thought, I do like a piece of string cheese. And I'd grown up on it, because it's easy to eat packaged meals like that. And I just remember being so revolted at the time that I went cold turkey vegan for a good long time.
Nice.
Honestly, until I went to India, which had a negative impact on my diet.
Well, it is interesting though, isn't it? I mean, India, it's easy to be vegetarian and eat pure veg, but considering the dairy and the cows are so holy and auspicious that it's pretty difficult to avoid milk.
Yeah, our teacher was telling us to drink 1 liter of milk per day and all of that.
Yeah.
I want
to say something.
yeah,
like
please.
to your point, the point about kids, and like no one grows up thinking, oh yeah, I need to eat animal protein to be healthy. My son, I was vegetarian when I had my son, and I never really pushed any kind of diet on him in particular, but he just never grew up eating meat. And the few times he was offered it, he wasn't really into it. He would take a bite of, he went to a birthday party once, and I didn't say, oh, he can't eat that or anything. So he'd eat I think it was like a ham and cheese sandwich or something. And he took one bite, and then he gave it to me can you do something with this? And yeah. And then when he was a little bit older, he kind of made the association between the meat products and then the animals, so instead of saying, oh, that's ham, I'd say, oh, that's a pig. Or instead of beef, I'd say that's a cow.
Yeah.
And so because he had that association with the animals, then he was really against it. Really, really against it. And he became, I used to call him my militant vegan, because he was violently opposed to eating animals.
He wouldn't even eat the fake meat or
for a long time
he cooked in the house, because he would look at it. It's that's not right.
Yeah.
It's I'm cooking at it because it's familiar, Can we pause 1 second? I'm going to try and fix the situation with my dogs.
Well, he's quiet now.
Yeah, I guess they're quiet.
I don't know. Anyway,
I feel like I can fix it permanently. I'm going to give them a treat. I'll be right. I
already did that.
You gave them a treat up there? What'd you give them? One of the sticks?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, never mind. That's what I was going to do. Okay, I'm sorry for the delay.
I already just did that,
No
and
problem.
I put him in his little cage thing.
Okay.
Great.
Right.
But
he's quiet now.
Harmony, that's I'm sorry. Yeah. That's great about your son. I talk about some studies in my book that were done with children in the United States, ages 4 to 8. And the study determined that, children are unsuspecting meat eaters, which goes back to what I said, is how we're indoctrinated into eating animals without realizing we're doing it. And 84% of the children surveyed said it was wrong to eat a cow. 79% said it was wrong to eat a pig. 41% said bacon came from plants. So,
my goodness.
The study showed that children are not aware of where the food on their plate comes from, and so they were looking at why is this, and part of it is parents have their own uneasy feelings about eating animals. They're trying to teach the children to love and care for animals, but then they're feeding them other animal parts, on their plates. And this is known as the omnivore's dilemma or the meat paradox. It's this conflict that many meat eaters have because, most people believe that it's wrong to do unnecessary harm to animals.
Yeah.
Right. 3 times a day, they're engaged in activities that create the, horrendous harm for animals.
Yeah.
And so, this conflict operates, in the background. It's subconsciously, it's there all the time. And then when certain things happen and it comes to the conscious mind, then we have a lot of dissonance. And the term actually psychologists use is cognitive dissonance. So people who eat animal-based foods become very agitated being around someone who doesn't. So there were some studies done at Bellarmine University, which is in Louisville, Kentucky, just near where I live. And it showed that, meat eaters become agitated just merely by being in the presence of a person who's plant-based. And us poor plant-based eaters, we don't have to do anything. We're just doing our own thing. And all of a sudden we're getting all this hate from people.
It's horrific.
I think it's so powerful, though. Like a book like yours can really, I mean, if it reaches someone at the right time, it can really shift things. Because I remember that's really what shifted. I was, when I first became vegetarian and I was vegan for a while at that time too, I was like 15 years old and I had read Tom Robbins' book, A Diet for a Small America,
Diet for a New America.
A New America.
Yeah, I think so.
And it really,
wonderful book.
It really, he has Diet for a Small Planet and Diet for a New America. That's what it is. Yeah. And it really like impacted me into realizing the environmental implications as well as, what's really going on.
Someone who reviewed my book, and I'll just brag on my book for a minute, said that they thought, in reading my book, they said my book was an updated version of Diet for a New America that had all the latest science in it. So that was like, oh my gosh, that was such praise. I was thrilled to hear that. And that was what I wanted to do, is I wanted to provide the science, because I'm all about helping people make informed decisions. And I think the science that I talk about in my book will help people make better choices for themselves and for their families and for the planet and for the animals, starting with the food on their plates. And mainstream media doesn't really talk about the connection between what we're eating and the environmental impacts and climate change impacts. Our mainstream media is focused primarily on fossil fuel industry, while ignoring the implications of the food that we're producing. In fact, I got a survey came across in my email today from New York Times. They had a survey today, and it was all about what actions do Americans take to reduce their carbon footprint, and how effective are they? And so it was just a little quiz you could take. Maybe it had 15 questions. And you could say whether recycling had a high impact on lowering your carbon footprint, a medium impact, or a low impact. And so you'd answer these questions, and they'd give you the answer. Well, the last question was veganism, and of course, I knew the answer. You knew the answer. It is like the single most important thing you can do to lower your carbon footprint. So I said it's high. Only 6% of the people who took the survey answered that question correctly.
Wow.
And,
Absolutely.
that's why I wrote my book. People aren't making the connection. And, only 6% of the people answered that question correctly. That says we have a lot of work to do, a lot of work to do ahead of us to connect the dots. But the dots are there, and the science is there. My book is not my opinion. It's the science. And I think that's why it came out in October 11th. And so far, every review of my book on Amazon, BookBuddy, NetGalley, every review has been 5 stars. It's because this isn't me just spouting off my opinions. This is me showing the science behind my position, which is advocating for a plant-based lifestyle to help reduce needless suffering, needless human suffering, animal suffering, and the suffering of the our planet. We are destroying this planet in the name of meat, and it doesn't have to be this way. We were taught this, and so that's why on my book, you can see I have a hand offering the reader the red pill, like Neo offered. Like Morpheus offered Neo in the Matrix movies, and that's just to symbolize that we have a choice. We don't think we have this choice because we don't see outside the Meatrix. We think that we need meat and animal-based foods for calcium and for protein, and we're conditioned to think that the Meatrix has a monopoly on these ingredients when it doesn't. I mean, all the nutrients we need to be healthy at any stage of life can be found in plants, and that's according to the United States Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So again, that's not me saying it, that's the science. So.
Yeah. We watched a documentary with Arnold Schwarzenegger produced that was really nice on the vegan-based athlete and the kind of propaganda that he had been fed about that. And it was amazing to think about how he had been conditioned to think that he needed meat to build muscle. And it reminded me of when I first started being a vegan when I was 18, 19. and as I was joking before, it really made every single person I was around uncomfortable, and every single meal, inevitably, someone would be hysterical about my decision. And it was,
Yeah.
but I remember someone
Wow.
saying to me, like, "Well, how are you going to get strong if you're not eating meat?" And I just remember looking at them and thinking, like, "Have you never seen a bull or
Right.
a rhinoceros or an elephant in your damn life?" And I'm like,
Yeah.
they build enormous muscle masses on an entirely
Mhm.
vegan diet, and
How do we think the cows get their muscles? They're
Yeah.
eating plants.
exactly,
So
yeah,
it's this mentality that we are force fed, and that's why I think choosing the red pill is freeing ourselves from this false narrative that we've been force fed since birth, that we need animal based foods, and that eating
right,
them is, like I said, natural, necessary, and nutritious. And it just the reason it freaks people out and it doesn't, register with them is because the science is at odds with the marketing of these products. And so
Yeah.
the Meatrix is masterful at marketing their products to us. And so some of the most effective media campaigns in my lifetime have been from the meat and dairy industries. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Got
right,
milk, milk, it does a body good. The incredible edible egg, pork, the other white meat. These are
yeah,
some of the most effective ad campaigns that have come
Yeah.
out in generations. And it just
hmm
gets us, it's immense. It's the message that it's immense in our minds is that we need these products. And in
But I think
fact,
there's
it's been
something like
highly effective.
there's something even more
Yeah,
sinister going on that I think, which is the lobby groups and the government subsidizing of meat and dairy
right.
products. Because if you actually had to pay what it costs to raise a cow, keep a cow, kill a cow, and all of the resources that go
getting
into
the cow to
feeding the
market.
cow and getting like all of it, and it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't subsidized, there'd be a lot less people eating meat because it would be unaffordable.
Exactly. That I
And
talk about that in
so
my
that,
book.
like, yeah, that's crazy when you start realizing that the
Yep.
government itself is subsidizing these industries to get you to eat more of it because of the powerful lobby
Right.
groups involved. And so as a
Mm-hmm.
taxpayer, all of your money is going to to the meat and dairy industry, even if you
Yeah,
don't
that's
want
why I
it
call
to.
it. That's why I talk in my book about, Eisenhower warned the country in 1961 about the military industrial complex. Well, now we're living
Mm,
under the meat industrial complex, and it's just as damaging as the military. I mean, it's
yeah.
killing all of us. In 2019, our U.S. government gave the beef industry $9 billion in direct and indirect payments. So that's that, like you said, it's our taxpayer money going directly as a handout to cattle
Mhm.
ranchers to create their products so that we can have a $4 hamburger. And so what I talk about in my book is that we need to change how we are subsidizing food in this country. For every dollar that a lentil grower receives from the government, a cattle rancher receives $480. I mean, that's
Holy,
crazy.
that's
So
You know,
we
huge.
need to,
to
yeah.
that point, I think it's interesting. We were watching this. I think it was really bad TV. I can't quite remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it was like Golden Stone or
Yellowstone?
Yellowstone. And in
Mhm.
that show, I kept seeing all of these subtle
Mm.
propaganda techniques to undermine uh, liberal vegetarian uh, choices. And I kept seeing it over and over again. I kept seeing the writers kind of trying to uh,
Legitimize?
legitimize the cattle industry. And I thought, oh, this is really
Yes.
interesting. Like they feel like it's necessary to make sure that they legitimize their choices. And
Hmm.
it'd be more interesting as a story, I think, if they talked about the real economics behind what they do.
Hmm. Yeah. I think the Meatrix, it have I don't know. I don't talk about this in my book, but I've thought about, times in my life when I've been in a relationship with someone who was insecure and they didn't value what they brought to the relationship. And so they tried to manipulate me into staying in the relationship or something. So to me, it's kind of like what the meat industry does. It knows that we don't need it. So it goes out of its way to try to convince us that, oh, we need it. We're going to suffer without it. And a lot of people think, you can go vegan for a year or two, but you're going to eventually wreck your health and you're going to have to go back to eating animal-based foods. That's kind of the mentality
How many times we
people
heard
have.
that? Yeah.
Yeah. But it's the exact opposite. The science that I show in my book, it says that the exact opposite happens. When we eat a healthy, whole foods, plant-based diet, then we restore our body's health and we increase our lifespan. We reduce inflammation in our bodies. We avoid so many chronic diseases and we have more time with our family and friends. But that goes against the narrative of the meat and dairy industry.
I'm eager to talk more about evolution. I just wonder, before we mention that, I wonder if you could talk more about say the impact on the environment, because I have this image in my head that of the Amazon rainforest and how people talked about a couple years ago about how we could really fight climate change if we just maintained the Amazon rainforest. But perhaps people don't understand that the major reason the Amazon rainforest is being razed to the ground is to create room for cattle. And that cattle industry is actually what's changing the entire shape of that incredibly important natural resource.
Yeah, that's right. It's either to have land for the animals themselves or to grow crops for the animals. And that's what is so important for us to realize, is that all these animals require an enormous amount of food and water. And 70% of the grain that we feed to livestock, 70% of the grain that we grow in the United States, we feed to livestock. Sorry about that. And so if we grew crops for human rather than animal consumption on the same amount of land, we could feed an additional 1 billion people in the United States. That's how much more food that we could grow for people. And globally, if we didn't grow crops for livestock, but grew crops for human consumption, we could feed an additional 4 billion people. So this is so important because we just had the 8 billionth person born on the planet just recently, and we're expected to reach close to 10 billion people on the planet by the year 2050. And so one of the reasons why we keep having to go into rich biospheres like the rainforest and elsewhere, we're cutting it down, clear cutting it, is so we can grow crops for the meat that we really don't need, and we'll be better off not having. But there's so much money to be made, and like I said, and we talked about earlier, the government is colluding with the meat and dairy industry. The meat and dairy industry generated $1.2 trillion of economic activity in the United States in 2020. That's 6% of our GDP. So there's a lot of people who want to maintain the status quo, and there's a lot of vested interest. There's a lot of money to be made in maintaining the status quo. But unfortunately, the status quo is the opposite of the red pill. It's the blue pill. And if we choose the blue pill, we're just going to get more of what we're seeing in the headlines already. We're seeing, climate change, emerging infectious diseases. We're seeing mass extinction rates, environmental degradation, huge biodiversity losses, and our health is just declining. And we're going to just get more and more of that if we choose the blue pill. But we have an option, and we can choose the red pill.
It reminds me of another to follow up on what you were saying, it reminds me of another episode that we saw in where they were liberal activists were being spoken to by the patriarch in Yellowstone about the amazing thing was the speciesism that was prevalent in the exchange, and that's something that you mentioned as well about speciesism. It said you don't care about the lives of these animals. Look at all of the animals that are killed when the soil is turned. And I thought it was just such an incredible hypocrisy because they would never, like the people on this ranch would never eat a dog. They'd never eat a cat. They'd never eat a horse because they have this speciesism ingrained in themselves. And that always sort of seemed to, as my yoga practice evolved over time, that always seemed to stick out to me as like, well, what do you care about? Whether or not, say, people and young men in Korea eat dogs, as they sometimes do when they're coming of age because they're going into the army. It's a kind of tradition, and it's another kind of way to another kind of racial bigotry against, say, Asian people that do that. But that in itself is a hypocrisy. And I wonder if you could talk more about that kind of speciesism, because you had mentioned that.
Yeah, so I talk about it in my book and some studies that show that, I alluded to the study about the children who were, ages 4 to 8, not knowing where food comes from. And, the reason that children at that age say it's wrong to eat a cow or a pig is they view all animals as being pet-like. They see a chicken as being like a dog or a cat. Because they see that animal has a life, it has value, and they know that they get affection, can get affection from it, or can give affection to it. So it's about empathy, I think, at that age, and I think that's something that we're all, almost all of us, are born with, this natural gift of empathy for all living creatures, but. And sadly, as we age, about the time that we become pre-adolescent, I'd say, is what the science says, is that we start putting animals into categories. And that's when we do the mental gymnastics and acrobatics that are required to make that shift from that all animals are being like our pets to, okay, these animals are pets and these are not. And that's something that happens because of culture. It's a culturally medicated or predicated idea. So like you said, in other parts of the world, people, their culture's different and they might eat dogs or horses where we don't in our culture. So I say in my book, if you're uneasy with the idea of eating your dog, you really should think about that, because this line between, what's an edible food or animal to a pet is just an arbitrary line that's been predetermined by the culture that we grew up in.
Yeah. There's a great book, speaking of books, called When Elephants Weep, that talk a lot about the inner emotions and the emotional aspect of all animals. And so that was also another influential book along my journey, looking at because some people say, well, they don't have feelings or they don't know what's going on. But I think if you actually do the research like you've done, you can see
it's a rich emotional tapestry.
Yeah, there's a rich emotional tapestry there. Exactly. And mothers who give birth to calves have an emotional connection to them. They're not just I don't give a shit. They're not
indifferent to their offspring,
Exactly.
Yeah, and fortunately, there's been, there are scientists now doing studies on the lives of farmed animals, and I talk about some of these studies in my book. And like you said, Russell, their lives are much richer and more complex than we ever imagined. And even under the incredible stress of factory farming, animals have family, friends, they play, they still, have capacities for all these emotions and a rich experience in life, even under the stresses that they're going through. So I talk about in my book, one of the studies, and I think it's really well known now that, there are people who have pigs as pets.
Yeah.
And, a pig can do anything that a dog can do. A pig can fetch a Frisbee. They're easily housebroken. You can train a pig to do just about anything that a dog can do. And it's been scientifically proven. And that blows my mind because, when you think about dogs, we have selectively bred dogs for 10 or 11,000 years to be, quote, man's best friend. So we have this, close relationship with dogs. And I have 2 dogs. I love my dogs, and they really make my life so much richer. But we have selectively bred pigs only to become food. And it makes me wonder, how much more companion-like could a pig be if we had invested, the last 10,000 years of breeding them to be our companions, So, but we don't think of pigs in this way. And this is because of speciesism. Like I said, we don't think of farmed animals as anything other than food commodities.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because I was thinking about that when you were talking about about the farmed animals having a rich emotional life. I was thinking about all those pets that are pigs out there, thinking, "Oh, let's talk about the pigs."
I worked on a pig farm in South Korea, and it was a harrowing experience that I was not prepared for. For one, because the animals responded so desperately to the presence of death, and if you had a dead pig in a pen, the other animals knew immediately, and they were not comfortable being around it. And I remember my job was at one point was to drag the dead animals away from the live ones, and they were just really, it was. As we were talking about this rich emotional landscape, the other thing I was not prepared for with pigs is the very human-like cry they make when they're hurt or when they're being lined up for slaughter. It like it sounds like a concentration camp of human squealing and human screaming, and how an industry could like the first pig farmer maintained his sense of
lack of empathy
is beside. I just can't understand it.
Yeah, it's incredible.
I'm sorry I'm sorry you had that experience. That must have been really, really hard.
Well, yeah, it's I have not had good experiences with these hunting and farming and fishing. Like on the whole, growing up, I grew up northwest of you in Illinois, and on the whole, every time someone took me to do one of these activities, like fishing, for example, and watching a fish suffocate to death on a boat, my mouth just dropped open like at my dad. Like, see, we have a fish now. It's like that fish is suffocating to death.
You have to hit it on the head with the hammer.
And like, oh man!
I hope in one of my chapters in my book, I think the chapter on tradition, with a story similar to that, where my father took me and my brother on our first fishing trip, and just how horrific it was for me. I had been looking forward to it all week, but then, the experience of it, I was not prepared at all for it.
Yeah.
And I've never gone fishing since. My dad never asked me if I wanted to go fishing again. And unfortunately my dad's, no longer alive, so I can't talk to him about how that experience was for him. And I kind of imagine, because he fished, I've seen pictures of him fishing, earlier in his life. And then I think he probably would have liked to have passed that tradition on to me and my brother. And, it didn't happen. I don't think my brother fishes either. And I just wonder if that was a disappointment for him because, it's something that he learned, I'm sure, from his father. And that's how we normalize behaviors that would otherwise seem barbaric. We normalize them because we call them traditions. And we teach young children that it's acceptable to do what you just said, just leave a fish on the deck of a boat to suffocate and die. And we normalize that. And then that's how, it just continues.
Yeah.
Just because something's been... No, go ahead.
Please.
I was just going to say, just because something has been a tradition isn't a good reason to continue it. There's a tradition, that we're still living with today. Women make 79 cents on the dollar to a man in the United States. Is that a tradition we want to keep continuing? I don't want to continue that. I'm sure most, if not all, women would like to discontinue that tradition. So,
well, I think we've been trying to for a while.
I wonder if you could talk about this quote that we have here. A plant-based person saves the life of one animal every day, and I've never seen that sentence before. But as I read it, I understood the truth of it. But I wonder if you could speak to it because it's such a wonderful kind of like almost like a Mr. Rogers statement.
Well, it is interesting because I think it can feel a little bit like
daunting.
Yeah, and also I think my parents. We've had an ongoing conversation about vegetarianism, veganism, the harm of eating a plant-based diet, ongoing for many, many years. My mother had breast cancer in 2005, and, I had her read the Colin T. Campbell book, the China study, and, so there was, there's been a lot of different phases, but I think when it comes down to it, there's kind of two things that go on. One is just not wanting to know. Like, it's too gruesome. It's too terrible to see, right? To like watch that documentary about factory farms and like, it's just too gruesome. It's too terrible.
Right.
They'd rather be blind to it. Or
ignorance is bliss.
Or also it feels like even if you don't do it, nothing's going to change, right? It feels too immense, too big to really like, well, what my actions aren't going to stop anything, right? And so there's kind of those two things I think that go on, and this quote sort of, I think, is like a little beacon of hope in a cruel world.
Yeah. I was being interviewed by someone and we talked about, and she taught me a term I didn't know, but that's called weaponized hopelessness. And that is where we give up hope because we think there's nothing that any one person can do. And I think the Meatrix exploits that. They want us to think that, your choices of the food on your plate aren't really making a difference. How can one person make a difference? And so when I ran across this poster, I was like, at first I thought, no, I can't be, because the poster said, a plant-based person saves 1,100 gallons of water, 45 pounds of grain, 35 square feet of forest, 20 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent, and the life of one animal every day. When I saw that, I was like, no way, I can't be, where is this information coming from? And actually, I traced it down and it comes from, basically government sources. It was, the material was used in a powerful documentary called Cowspiracy. So,
we saw that.
Yeah. So when people see that poster or see that graphic in my book, I hope, it'll just sink in that, this is really powerful. And, the entrenched powers that be don't want us as individuals to think that we have the power to make this change happen. And I think that's the only way it can happen, is from us individuals, because we change the world, I think, one person at a time. And like I said, the government and the Meatrix are working together. They're making so much money that this change to a plant-based lifestyle isn't going to come from above. It has to start from below with each of us individual. And it's so powerful because we would save so many resources and so much needed suffering by becoming plant-based. And one of the reasons why it's so important for climate change is that the animals that we use for livestock, they, especially ruminant animals, that's cows, sheep, goats, and lambs, they produce methane. And, if all the meat and dairy cows on the planet were a country, they would have more greenhouse gas emissions than the UK and EU combined. That's how, what a big impact that cows alone have on climate change. And that's because of methane. And, mainstream media, talks all the time about our need to move away from fossil fuels because burning them creates carbon dioxide and releases that into our atmosphere. And then they talk about we need to move away from gasoline and start driving electric vehicles. But mainstream media never talks about the impact of our food. Whereas, the science shows that methane, over the first 20 years, methane is 80 times more potent at trapping heat into our atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And over a 100-year period, it's 25 times more potent. So why is the mainstream media coming after methane? That's the low-hanging fruit, of our climate problem. And, this past year in the United States, we passed the first piece of legislation aimed at curbing emissions and fighting climate change. I'm really proud that we were able to do that. And it's a long time coming. I mean, historically, the United States has contributed the most to greenhouse gas emissions. So I was really grateful that we passed our first piece of legislation, but it's just a beginning. We need to do a lot more. But I downloaded the act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and looked at the climate change component. And I did a search on methane. I did a search on meat. And it talks about methane, but it doesn't talk about methane generated from animal agriculture. And this is a huge problem. It has been estimated by Stephen Chu, who's the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's a Nobel Prize recipient, and he was former Energy Secretary of the United States. He did a study and determined that 51% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from animal agriculture. And he's not alone. I mean, the World Bank Group, they had two lead environmental scientists who did a study. This was back in 2009. They came to the same conclusion. And I have this in my book, so the science is there. But they're saying that, look, 51% of all man-made greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock. And so to ignore this is going to be a huge problem. And we will never be able to reach our climate goals without widespread adoption of a plant-based lifestyle. There's just simply no way to do it because the Meatrix contributes so much to climate change.
I'm really glad that you brought up your mom, Harmony, because you talked about breast cancer and not to say that one choice necessarily led to the other, but I remember when I was in my travels in Asia, just how ridiculously small the percentages are for breast cancer compared to North America and England, and who have the bulk of the breast cancer cases in the world. And I was just shocked and stunned by that because I just grew up thinking, well, that's just something that happens when you have breasts. It's not something that happens when you have it's the addition of milk and cheese to your diet that creates the very high statistical anomaly that is breast cancer. Instead of but people normalize it and don't
Right.
look at what's happening around the rest of the world, say in Indonesia, where nobody gets breast cancer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so it's frustrating, because like those are things that you can really impact on your own daily basis with your own choices.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's right. I think about the health component of all this, and that I show in my book that in 2021 the top leading causes of death in the United States, I list them in my book, and then I show the science as to how a plant-based lifestyle helps us, avoid these leading causes of death, which are, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, chronic kidney disease, diabetes, and it leads to so much unnecessary suffering that we're eating the foods that land us into a medical crisis like that.
Yeah.
And I also think about the National Institute of Health. I uncovered this memo that the National Institute of Health sent to all physicians in the United States. And it said that the physicians should recommend a plant-based lifestyle to all their patients, especially those with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity. And that memo that was sent out to all doctors was in 2013. That was almost 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you all, but my doctors never asked me about the foods I eat.
No,
if anything, my doctor's like, oh, we need to check your vitamin B and D and iron values because you're vegetarian.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, the National Institute of Health knows what would make us all healthier and live longer lives. But physicians don't have that kind of training. And I talk about in my book why it is doctors won't talk to their patients about the food that they're eating. And I really like what there's a gastroenterologist named Dr. Will Bulsiewicz. He wrote a book called Fiber Fueled. And I talk about what he says in his book, in my book. And he says, the average American eats 3 pounds of food a day. And over a year, that's roughly 1,000 pounds of food. And over a lifetime, that's roughly 80,000 pounds of food. And there's no way that an isolated compound in a pharmaceutical or a nutritional supplement could overcome 80,000 pounds of a bad diet. And it's foolish for us to think that, that could happen. Yeah. But we keep popping pills and we keep going to the doctor, and the pharmaceutical industry keeps creating these drugs to address problems without dealing with the root cause, which is the food we're eating. And the problem is, there's no way to monetize a whole foods, plant-based lifestyle into a pill. I mean, there's so much money right now, Russell and Harmony, being spent on lab-grown meat and plant-based meat alternatives. And I mean, billions of dollars. And that's a very high-tech approach to solving a very solvable problem with a very low-tech solution. Fruits and veggies and whole grains and seeds and nothing. All this money is being spent, and companies are suing each other over intellectual property. And I mean, it's just it's crazy. It is, and I mean, literally billions of dollars are being spent to try to solve this in a very high-tech way when there's such a low-tech solution.
What was it in 2008? Because it was 2008, wasn't it, that you went completely plant-based? Or what happened in 2008 that sort of motivated you to change something?
Well, in 2008, I did become plant-based and have been since then. I really don't talk about this in my book because my editor was like, now, when did you become plant-based? How long have you been plant-based? There was all these questions and there was confusion. I was like, well, I better just make this real simple so, it's not confusing for people. But I became plant-based actually in 1985 and was plant-based for 2 years. And then I started traveling, and I couldn't maintain a plant-based lifestyle traveling in the United States. It was just impossible. So I reluctantly became a vegetarian and ate cheese and eggs and dairy products. And I maintained that until 2008. And that's when I realized, it's easier now. I can do it. It takes effort, but I can make it happen and still maintain my health while traveling. And, it's become easier and easier. I mean, it's never been as easy as it is now to become plant-based.
That's right.
There's so many options. I mean, you can get an Impossible Whopper at Burger King, and it may not be all plant-based, but it's, fast food has a lot of plant-based vegan offerings.
They've responded to the market, haven't they?
Yeah,
they have. And it's because the growth has not been steady. There's been an explosion of plant-based eaters, particularly in the United States and the UK. Between 2015 and 2019, the number of people identifying as plant-based in the UK quadrupled. So it's been similar in the United States. So it hasn't been a steady growth. It's been an explosion of people choosing to eat this way. And I think it's going to only get more and more as more people discover, how powerful it is for themselves and for the planet and for the animals.
Yeah.
It's just undeniable.
Yeah, well, it's definitely a smart move on A&W's. I hadn't eaten at a fast food restaurant for, I don't know, like decades.
Yeah.
and when they came out with their Beyond Meat burger, that's become like a regular stop for our son for sure.
Things are definitely different. Like the number of times 30 years ago where if I said something like mais je suis végétarien, je n'ai pas de le produit du lait, and then I was offered pork. You are vegetarian, sir. You must eat pork, and like the thousands of pounds of pork I would pick out of my bibimbap in Korea every day, trying to get a vegetarian meal. Like it's just not the same way anymore. Yeah. People are much more sensitive to it. I don't get called Monsieur Carotte anymore.
Mr.
Which was always very offensive. But I wonder if you. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was going to say, we have seen an explosion of people adopting a plant-based lifestyle in the United States and in Europe and in the UK. Unfortunately, the Meatrix is growing enormously globally as more and more people are demanding animal-based foods. They covet a Western lifestyle, and a Western lifestyle is associated with eating fast food, eating hamburgers and fried chicken and all these Meatrix products, animal-based foods. And so when countries like China and India have seen a huge growth in their middle class and affluence, and so people all over the world now are adopting this Western style eating pattern. And
they identify affluence with eating meat, and you see that everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is very alarming for everybody, especially environmentalists and climate scientists and people who are concerned with animal welfare. The population is expected to grow by like 22% between now and 2050, but the demand for meat and dairy is supposed to increase by 60%.
Wow.
And we've already talked about how we're deforesting the earth in order to grow crops for these animals. And another reason why this is a problem is because over 60% of all emerging infectious diseases have a wildlife origin. So when we're going in and chopping down the rainforest, we don't know what virus may be lurking in these pristine areas that we've never encountered, and we may have no immunity against. So it just is. We're playing Russian roulette with another pandemic by chopping down these areas so we can grow more plants for more animals.
Another thing that you mentioned in your here that was so interesting to me was that this busting more meat myths like evolution, for example. And That made a lot of sense to me. For example, when people said, "Oh yeah, you'll get colon cancer if you eat meat because our intestines are short," or excuse me, our intestines are quite long, and so the meat stays in the intestines for a long time, unlike our dog or a cat whose intestines are quite short, so they get rid of the meat product very quickly. But it rots in our stomachs, and then we get colon cancer. I hadn't done the math to equate the same thing with milk and breast cancer, but I wonder if you could talk more about that evolution, about how it's sold to us that we're evolved to eat meat. People always point to their one little canine tooth out of 30 every time. Like, there are 29 other teeth,
Yeah. I talk about this in my book. In fact, I have a chart that compares the anatomy of a carnivore, an omnivore, and an herbivore, and a human. And a human checks all the boxes of an herbivore every time. Yet, humans consider themselves as, at least most people think of themselves as omnivores, and there are a growing number of people who think of themselves as carnivores,
That's right.
Paleo diet people and things like that. So, I think that my editor, when she was reading that part of my book, she was like, "Oh, that's really compelling." And, it is compelling, but it's something that I think most of us learned in grade school. But we've forgotten it. We were taught, we were taught these things, we compared, but somewhere along the line, it just didn't register to us like, oh yeah, what, maybe we're getting sick because the food we're eating isn't the food that, our bodies are meant to be eating. Just looking at our saliva, that's where our digestion begins, with our saliva. A carnivore doesn't have any digestive enzymes in their saliva, and their canine teeth are so much larger, elongated. That's for ripping flesh. They have claws for catching prey. We don't have claws. We've invented weapons so that we could do it. But carnivores, just rip chunks of meat and swallow it whole because their gastric juices are so strong. That's where they digest the meat. And if we did that, we become deathly ill. And their digestive tract, like you said, Russell, is so much shorter because, meat has to pass through their system much more quickly, because it can rot and putrefy and create, illnesses. So, I think that the anatomy component of this is very compelling. And so I included that in my book too. So. In our teeth, we have molars. That's for grinding, plant material. If you look at even our jaw structure, if you look at the jaw structure of a carnivore, their jaw just moves up and down. It doesn't move side to side. But every herbivore, their jaw is like ours. It moves side to side and up and down. And that's for grinding plant material. And another thing that I didn't put in my book, but, why do cats spend so much time laying down and sleeping? Well, if you look at their anatomy, it would be the equivalent of us. When they stand, they're on their tiptoes. It would be like us. Every time we stood up, we would be on our tiptoes. Well, we would not stand for long. We would always find a place to sit down or lie down if we had to be on our tiptoes every time we stood up. Well, why are cats on their tiptoes, and dogs too? So they can catch prey more quickly. They're already ready, and here we are, flat-footed. We stand because we're herbivores that are picking fruits off of trees and things like that. So I think that the anatomy argument is very compelling, and I included that in my book.
I wonder if you could also talk about some of the other medical consequences of eating meat that you mentioned, like say the effect of eating meat on the brain, or the effect of eating meat on the respiratory system, on the lungs.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that I learned while researching my book just blew my mind. I knew about heart disease and saturated fats, but the connection between cognitive decline and Alzheimer's with eating animal-based foods, that was something I didn't know anything about. And that really surprised me that there is such a strong connection there. 6 to 7% of Alzheimer's is late onset, and it has like a genetic component. But most of the Alzheimer's that we have in this country does not have a genetic component to it, and it's all attributed to lifestyle. And so the saturated fats that are found in animal-based foods, it just doesn't clog the arteries feeding blood to our heart, like you said you saw, Russell, in that autopsy, the plaque that was in the arteries. That plaque is indiscriminate. It affects the blood flow everywhere in our bodies, and that includes the blood flow to our brain. And so, so that affects our cognition. Also, animal-based foods are highly inflammatory, and we know now that so much of cognitive decline is caused by inflammation in the brain. And then when we eat foods, we have our bodies metabolize the food we eat, and it creates advanced glycation endpoints, or AGEs. And
I'm sorry, could you say that again? Advanced glycation points?
Endpoints. Advanced glycation endpoints, AGEs. And these are oftentimes removed from our body, but our body also has receptors and stores AGEs. And so the foods that have the highest amount of these glycation endpoints are animal-based foods, dairy, butter, meat, eggs. And so when we remove animal-based foods from our diet, we're reducing the number of AGEs in our diet drastically. And this is also really helps us keep our inflammation down to lower levels. And, so many of the chronic illnesses that we have in this country start with inflammation.
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made that almost every single one of them starts with inflammation. It's
I think that's what science is showing now.
Critical. It's a critical thing.
That's why, and that's why antioxidants are so important, is because they remove these AGEs from our bodies. So we want to be eating foods that are high in antioxidants. But we can also reduce the AGEs in our body also by eliminating the animal-based foods that is responsible for creating so many of the AGEs to begin with. So we get rid of the animal-based foods, we're lowering the AGEs. Then with our whole foods, plant-based lifestyle, we're eating higher numbers of antioxidants. We're removing even more of the AGEs that we get from, it's just we can reduce all AGEs in our bodies, but we have to eat a raw food diet to do it. Not many people are going to eat a raw food diet. So a plant-based lifestyle is good at keeping the AGEs lower in our body. And then if we eat a lot of antioxidants, we can remove those AGEs, and they won't get stored in our tissues, and we'll feel better. We'll have less inflammation, fewer aches and pains. We'll feel better when we get up in the morning.
Yeah.
We'll think more clearly.
What would you say, because I think some people can wrap their head around, becoming vegetarian, but keeping the eggs and the dairy in the diet, I think is pretty compelling for a lot of people. Do you have any thoughts or advice since you went fully plant-based? What, any benefits you've noticed, or just any tips or tricks to getting rid of those incredibly addictive dairy products?
Because we're going to do a vegan January.
Veganuary. So we're gonna be saying goodbye to our dairy.
Oh, good for you. Yeah, it's never been easier to do it. I mean, there's so many. Just like there's plant-based meat alternatives. There's so many more out there now. There's so many more plant-based dairy alternatives out there now than there were just even a few years ago. I mean, I don't know where you all live. Here in Kentucky, we have a lot of Kroger.
The grocery
stores. Yeah. And at Kroger's, they have their own line of food products. And Kroger makes a plant-based sour cream. They make vegan cheese. They make plant-based, milk. I mean, so it's just never been easier. And I think, you'll find it really easy to give up your dairy.
Yeah.
But I have to say that, that was one of the hardest things. I think because it is so addictive.
It's so
after I
addictive.
became plant-based, I still craved a pizza, a cheese pizza for a while. But, I don't even think about, and that cravings totally disappeared. And it, it didn't linger for long, but, for a while I would notice, I would really love a pizza about now. Well, the good news is you can go to Kroger's and buy a plant-based pizza in the freezer that has vegan cheese on it. And, and I think it'll blow your mind, because this isn't like vegan cheese from years ago. It's they've made
like the
just like you can get
Bio Life.
It's like you can you have these plant-based meat alternatives that are so much, quote, meatier than black bean burgers were back in the day.
True.
The same was with the same with cheese. It's really come a long way.
We actually have some pizza parlors here, like our one down on Center Street, that you can just even order a plant-based cheese. You can do gluten-free and you can do plant-based cheese. So they do even make it right from the pizza place.
But to be honest, when I was from the age of 16 to 27, when I was vegan and sometimes raw food, I would except for rice, I kind of gave myself that indulgence. I would eat cooked rice, but I was raw foodist in every other way.
Nice.
I never really thought about cravings for cheese or milk. I didn't think about any of those things. I had my own wheatgrass farm in my house that I grew wheatgrass, and I'd chop my own wheatgrass and grind it and drink that. I didn't really think about it. I just kind of settled into, I guess really what I settled into was a kind of a Korean-based diet, which is, miso soup, rice, and barbecue sauce.
Right.
And that's just what there's a lot of sugar in that rice and barbecue sauce. But I'm hard pressed to feel like I had a craving until I went to Korea, and then it was just
India. You mean
India? Excuse me. Until I went to India. Yeah.
Well, it's like once you eat the dairy, it creates that craving. I think because it has those opiates in it.
The opiates. Now, opiates are something I can really get behind. I do like those.
Maybe just replace your cheese with heroin, and the problem solved.
I think in Kentucky, people really like opiates and opioids, don't they? There's people really have a taste for it.
Unfortunately, we've been the victim of the opioid epidemic. It's been really sad. It's really destroyed a lot of lives in Eastern Kentucky. So, but the dairy is something that it is very highly addictive, and I think it's because of the dopamine that is released in our brains when we eat.
That's right.
Foods that are high in sodium and fat, or high in sugar and fat, have this effect of releasing dopamine, which makes us feel good. So until we don't, don't, and And I wanted to mention, Russell, you were talking about how you ate when you were in Korea. We talk about people being lactose intolerant. And I kind of wanted to talk about this because this goes back to us thinking that eating animal-based foods is natural. 75% of the people on the planet are lactose intolerant. They are the vast majority of people who, cannot digest milk products. Yet in the United States, we consider people who can't digest milk as lactose intolerant.
That's
so
right.
we make them, like they're the others, and we're the majority. But in a global perspective, 75% of the people can't digest milk. So how can you say eating dairy products is natural? What the term that I like is that the people who can digest milk and dairy, they're lactose persistent. They're people who have a mutation. They have a mutation that allows them to digest the sugars in milk after infancy. So we all have these enzymes when we're babies because we're, drinking breast milk. We need to be able to do that. But once we are weaned from our mother's milk, we lose that ability to digest milk. 75% of the people on the planet can't do it. So the people who can, as an adult, my father-in-law, he's 92 and he drinks a glass of milk like every day. And he has no problem doing it, but he's lactose persistent. And we have a joke with my father-in-law. He laughs about it, but we call his milk, and he laughs. We call it bovine titty juice. So,
bovine titty juice, brought to you by the milk industry. I think it speaks to the unnaturalness of it when you think about how that evolved in Caucasian people, because it is the Caucasians who have the enzyme on the whole to digest milk, produit du laitier. And it's so interesting because what's unnatural about that is that if you shove millions of Europeans together into tiny little ghetto cities and they start, sharing diseases with each other, and then you get a black plague, and the only way that you can survive is to drink milk because the water is so filthy. Then the only people who are going to live are the people who have that capacity to drink milk. That's an incredibly unnatural way to develop the ability to eat cheese. It is not. That's not as God intended. Your water's filthy. You're shoved into each other, and everyone's eating rat feces. That is not how God intended you. But here we are.
Well, it's been so wonderful to talk about this. It's one of our favorite topics, actually. We talk about it all the time in our house.
Wonderful. Well, I'm glad that you do. I think we need to have more conversations about this because, as I said, our media doesn't talk about it. So maybe, as friends and family, we can start these discussions on podcasts like this so that we can start, making choices that I think are better for everybody. It's a win-win-win for ourselves, the planet, and the animals. So I appreciate you having me on your podcast. It's been great meeting you and discussing the impact of our food choices in my book. And if people want to find me, they can find me at my website, stuartwaldner.com. They can find my book, Escape the Meatrix, Eat Plants, Feel Great, and Save the Planet, on Amazon. And I'm on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. So I hope people will connect with me there. And
we'll link it all in the show notes too, so they can find you in all the places.
Okay, appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart. It was a real pleasure to meet you today.
Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure meeting you all too. Thanks, Russell.
I can't wait to dig into your book. It's going to inspire me in my veganuary.
Yes.
Okay.